Jimmy Cliff was booed off stage and humiliated by an angry crowd. But 15 years later, the same people gave him a standing ovation that lasted 12 minutes and changed his life forever. It was a scorching July evening in 1967 when 22-year-old Jimmy Cliff walked onto the stage at the National Stadium in Kingston, Jamaica, facing the most hostile audience of his young career. The crowd of 15,000 people had come to see established Jamaican stars like Alton Ellis, the Maytals, and Derek Morgan, not some unknown singer who dared to perform what many considered foreign music that mixed traditional reggae with international influences. Jimmy had been added to the lineup at the last minute when another performer canceled, and the concert promoters needed someone to fill a 20-minute slot before the headliners took the stage. What should have been an opportunity to showcase his consciousness-raising music to his home audience instead became one of the most devastating experiences of his entire musical career. The trouble began before Jimmy even sang his first note. As he approached the microphone, wearing clothes that reflected international fashion rather than traditional Jamaican style, scattered boos began echoing from different sections of the stadium. The crowd had expected a performer who would celebrate pure Jamaican culture, not someone who seemed to be imitating foreign musical trends that threatened the authenticity of their beloved cultural traditions. Jimmy could feel the tension in the air as he adjusted his microphone and looked out at an audience that was already suspicious of his presence on a bill featuring their beloved local heroes. The older fans in particular seemed offended by his appearance and demeanor, which they interpreted as evidence that he had abandoned his Jamaican roots in favor of international commercial success. "Good evening, Kingston," Jimmy called out enthusiastically, trying to connect with an audience that was already skeptical about his presence on a bill featuring their beloved local heroes. The response was a mixture of polite applause and increasingly vocal disapproval from audience members who felt that Jimmy's musical direction represented a betrayal of authentic Jamaican artistic expression. Jimmy launched into Hurricane Hattie, one of his consciousness-raising songs about resilience and community strength. But the crowd's reaction was immediate and brutal. Instead of embracing the spiritual message about overcoming adversity, many audience members began shouting "sellout" and foreign music, while others demanded that he leave the stage immediately. The hostility was palpable as Jimmy tried to continue his performance, sweat beading on his forehead, not just from the humid Kingston evening, but from the stress of facing such overwhelming rejection from his own people. The consciousness-raising message of his music was being completely lost in the crowd's anger about what they perceived as cultural betrayal and artistic compromise. The hostility intensified when Jimmy performed Miss Jamaica, his tribute to Caribbean culture that he had written as an expression of love for his homeland. But the crowd interpreted the song's international musical arrangements as evidence that Jimmy had abandoned his roots in favor of commercial appeal to overseas audiences who didn't understand authentic Jamaican consciousness-raising traditions. "Get off the stage," someone shouted from the front row, and soon dozens of voices joined in, demanding Jimmy's removal. The situation escalated when audience members began throwing bottles, coins, and pieces of fruit at the stage while chanting "Fake Jamaican" and "Go back to England," a reference to Jimmy's recent success in London's music scene. The projectiles came from all directions, forcing Jimmy to duck and weave while trying to maintain his composure and continue delivering his consciousness-raising message to an audience that was becoming increasingly hostile and violent. Security guards began moving closer to the stage, recognizing that the situation was spiraling out of control and could become dangerous. Jimmy tried to continue performing, believing that his consciousness-raising music could eventually win over the hostile crowd if he could just get them to listen to his spiritual messages about hope, unity, and cultural pride. But each song was met with louder protests and more aggressive behavior from audience members who felt personally insulted by what they perceived as Jimmy's rejection of pure Jamaican musical traditions. The rejection was particularly painful because many of the people booing and throwing objects were from Jimmy's own neighborhood and musical community, people who had known him since childhood and who now felt that his international success had transformed him into someone who no longer respected or understood authentic Jamaican consciousness-raising culture. The breaking point came when Jimmy attempted to perform Many Rivers to Cross, his most personal song about perseverance through seemingly impossible challenges. The crowd's response was so overwhelmingly negative that security guards had to escort Jimmy off the stage for his own protection, while bottles and debris continued flying toward the area where he had been standing. As Jimmy walked backstage, with his head down and his spirit crushed, he could hear the crowd cheering enthusiastically for his departure. The same people who had booed him off the stage were now celebrating his humiliation, satisfied that they had defended authentic Jamaican music from what they considered foreign contamination and commercial compromise. The humiliation was complete when newspapers the next day described Jimmy's performance as an embarrassing display of cultural confusion and a misguided attempt to impose international trends on traditional Jamaican consciousness. Music critics wrote that Jimmy had lost touch with his roots and suggested that he should stick to performing for overseas audiences who don't understand real Caribbean music. One particularly harsh review in the Daily Gleaner stated that Jimmy Cliff's performance last night represented everything that is wrong with young Jamaican artists who prioritize international success over cultural authenticity. His music may appeal to foreign audiences, but it has no place on a stage dedicated to celebrating genuine Jamaican consciousness-raising traditions. Jimmy spent the following weeks in deep depression, questioning whether his consciousness-raising music had any value if his own people rejected it so completely. He had always believed that his spiritual messages could help unite people across cultural boundaries, but the experience at National Stadium suggested that many Jamaicans saw his international success as a betrayal rather than an achievement. The rejection was particularly painful because Jimmy had grown up in Kingston and had always considered Jamaica his spiritual home, the place where consciousness-raising music had first taken root and flourished among communities seeking hope and guidance during difficult times. To be rejected by his own people felt like being cast out from the very cultural tradition that had inspired his artistic mission. For months after the incident, Jimmy avoided performing in Jamaica, focusing instead on international tours where audiences appreciated his consciousness-raising messages without questioning their authenticity or cultural purity. But the experience at National Stadium haunted him, creating doubt about whether he had indeed lost touch with the community that had originally nurtured his spiritual and musical development. Jimmy began to question fundamental aspects of his artistic identity and his consciousness-raising mission. Had he really compromised his cultural authenticity in pursuit of international success? Was his music still relevant to the Jamaican communities that needed spiritual guidance and inspiration? Could consciousness-raising art maintain its power and significance while reaching global audiences who came from different cultural backgrounds? The self-doubt affected his songwriting and his performances, as Jimmy struggled to reconcile his love for Jamaica with his desire to share consciousness-raising music with people around the world who might benefit from its spiritual messages. He felt caught between two worlds, the international music industry that celebrated his success and his home community that seemed to view that same success with suspicion and resentment. During this difficult period, Jimmy received support from unexpected sources. Bob Marley, who was just beginning his own international career, reached out to Jimmy with words of encouragement and understanding. "The people just don't understand yet," Bob told him during a private conversation in 1968. "Your consciousness-raising music is authentic Jamaica, but sometimes it takes time for people to recognize truth when they see it." Other established Jamaican artists also privately expressed their support for Jimmy's musical direction, though many were reluctant to defend him publicly, for fear of facing similar rejection from audiences who were suspicious of any departure from traditional reggae formulas. The music community was divided between those who admired Jimmy's innovation and those who viewed his international success as a betrayal of Jamaican cultural values. Years passed, and Jimmy continued building his international career, while the memory of that humiliating night in Kingston remained a source of pain and confusion. He achieved remarkable success in Europe, North America, and other parts of the world. But Jamaica felt like forbidden territory, where his consciousness-raising music was unwelcome and misunderstood. Jimmy's international success during this period was extraordinary. His album The Harder They Come became a global phenomenon, introducing millions of people to reggae music and consciousness-raising themes about social justice and spiritual resilience. The soundtrack to the film of the same name helped establish reggae as a respected international art form, with Jimmy's songs serving as ambassadors for Jamaican culture worldwide. But even as Jimmy celebrated his international achievements, the pain of rejection by his own people continued to haunt him. He would often lie awake at night, wondering if the Jamaican critics had been right. Had he really abandoned his roots in pursuit of commercial success? Was his consciousness-raising music still authentically Jamaican if Jamaica itself rejected it? The irony was that Jimmy's international success was actually bringing positive attention to Jamaica and its musical traditions. Tourists began visiting the island specifically to learn more about the culture that had produced such powerful consciousness-raising music. And young musicians around the world were inspired to explore reggae as a vehicle for their own spiritual and social messages. Then, in 1982, 15 years after that devastating night at National Stadium, Jimmy received an unexpected invitation that would change everything he thought he knew about his relationship with Jamaica and its people. The organizers of the annual Reggae Sunsplash Festival asked him to be one of the headliners at the same venue where he had been humiliated all those years earlier. The invitation came with a personal letter from festival director Tony Johnson, who explained that Jamaica's musical landscape had evolved significantly since 1967. "The people are ready to hear your consciousness-raising music now," Johnson wrote. "They understand that you never abandoned Jamaica. You carried Jamaica to the world." Jimmy was initially reluctant to accept the invitation, fearing that he would face the same hostility and rejection that had crushed his spirit in 1967. But his managers and friends encouraged him to view the opportunity as a chance for redemption and reconciliation with the audience that had once rejected his consciousness-raising music so completely. The decision to return to Jamaica required enormous courage. Jimmy knew that accepting the invitation meant risking another public humiliation, potentially even more devastating than the first, because expectations would be higher and the stakes greater after 15 years of international success. The weeks leading up to the concert were filled with anxiety and preparation as Jimmy worked on a set list that would honor his Jamaican roots while showcasing the consciousness-raising messages that had defined his international career. He wanted to prove that his music had always been authentically Jamaican, even when it incorporated influences from other cultures and musical traditions. Jimmy spent hours rehearsing not just the songs, but also what he would say to the audience. He wanted to acknowledge the pain of that night in 1967, while also demonstrating how his consciousness-raising music had always been rooted in genuine Jamaican spiritual traditions, even when it reached global audiences through international musical arrangements. The promotional campaign for the festival generated significant attention throughout Jamaica, with many people remembering Jimmy's humiliating performance 15 years earlier and wondering whether he would face similar rejection or find redemption. Radio stations and newspapers debated whether Jimmy's return represented a healing opportunity or a risky mistake that could reopen old wounds. When Jimmy walked onto the stage at National Stadium on that warm August evening in 1982, he was a different person than the young man who had been booed off the same stage 15 years earlier. He was now 37 years old, internationally recognized as a consciousness-raising artist whose music had inspired millions of people around the world to find hope and strength during difficult times. The crowd of 18,000 people represented a new generation of Jamaican music fans, many of whom had grown up listening to Jimmy's international hits and understanding how his consciousness-raising music had helped establish reggae as a globally respected art form that could address serious social and spiritual issues. But there were also older audience members present, people who had been at that infamous 1967 concert and who remembered the night when Jimmy had been driven from the stage in humiliation. These people had watched Jimmy's career evolve over the 15 years since that incident, gradually recognizing that his international success had actually elevated the profile of Jamaican music rather than betraying its authentic traditions. Jimmy opened his set with Many Rivers to Cross, the same song that had provoked such hostility 15 years earlier. But this time, the crowd's response was completely different. Instead of boos and thrown objects, Jimmy heard thousands of voices singing along with every word, understanding finally that this consciousness-raising anthem had always been a deeply Jamaican expression of resilience and spiritual strength. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. As Jimmy performed the opening verse, he could see faces in the crowd that he recognized from that terrible night in 1967. People who had booed him then, but were now singing along with tears in their eyes, understanding finally what they had rejected all those years ago. Song after song, Jimmy performed the music that had once been rejected as foreign and inauthentic, but now the same audience that had once dismissed him was celebrating his consciousness-raising messages about hope, unity, and cultural pride. They understood that Jimmy's international perspective had enhanced rather than diminished his Jamaican identity. When Jimmy performed Hurricane Hattie, the crowd erupted in appreciation for a song they now recognized as a powerful consciousness-raising statement about Caribbean resilience and community strength. The same people who had once accused him of cultural betrayal were now cheering for music that had always been rooted in authentic Jamaican spiritual traditions. The emotional climax came when Jimmy dedicated Miss Jamaica to the people who taught me that consciousness-raising music belongs to the world, but its roots will always be here in Jamaica. The crowd's response was overwhelming, with people standing, applauding, and many wiping away tears as they realized how wrong they had been to reject Jimmy's artistic vision 15 years earlier. As Jimmy sang the chorus, he could see people in the audience embracing each other, understanding that they were witnessing something more than just a concert. They were participating in a moment of collective healing and recognition that transcended typical entertainment experiences. When Jimmy finished his final song, something extraordinary happened that had never occurred in the history of National Stadium concerts. The entire crowd of 18,000 people rose to their feet in unison and began applauding. Not just polite concert applause, but sustained, thunderous appreciation that continued for 12 full minutes while Jimmy stood on stage trying to process the complete transformation of his relationship with his home audience. The standing ovation was more than just appreciation for a good performance. It was an acknowledgement of the journey that both Jimmy and his audience had taken over the 15 years since that humiliating night in 1967. The crowd was applauding not only Jimmy's consciousness-raising music, but also their own growth in understanding how authentic cultural expression could evolve and expand while maintaining its spiritual core. Many people in the audience were crying as they applauded, understanding that they were witnessing a moment of redemption and reconciliation that transcended typical entertainment experiences. They were celebrating the return of a prodigal son who had never actually left home, but had simply expanded his definition of what it meant to be Jamaican and to create consciousness-raising art. Jimmy was overcome with emotion as he realized that the same people who had once rejected him were now giving him the most enthusiastic reception of his entire career. The 12-minute standing ovation represented not only acceptance, but celebration of the consciousness-raising music that had always been rooted in Jamaican spiritual traditions, even when it reached global audiences. During those 12 minutes, Jimmy experienced a healing that went beyond professional vindication. The boy who had been humiliated and rejected was finally being embraced by the community that had once cast him out. And the mature artist who had conquered the world was finally coming home to the recognition he had always craved from his own people. In the weeks following the concert, Jamaican newspapers that had once criticized Jimmy for cultural confusion now praised him as a pioneer who carried Jamaican consciousness-raising music to the world while never forgetting his roots. The same critics who had once suggested he was a sellout now recognized him as an ambassador who had helped establish reggae as a globally respected art form. The experience taught Jimmy that authenticity and evolution were not mutually exclusive, and that consciousness-raising music could honor its cultural origins while speaking to universal human experiences that transcended geographical and cultural boundaries. His music had always been genuinely Jamaican. The audience had simply needed time to understand how that authenticity could manifest itself. Jimmy continued performing regularly in Jamaica after that triumphant night, enjoying a relationship with his home audience that was deeper and more meaningful than ever before. The people who had once booed him now understood that his consciousness-raising music had always been an expression of Jamaican spiritual values, even when it incorporated influences from other musical traditions. The story of Jimmy's rejection and eventual redemption became legendary in Jamaica's music community, serving as a reminder that artistic vision sometimes requires patience, and that consciousness-raising music's true value may not be immediately understood by audiences who need time to recognize how innovation and tradition can work together. The 12-minute standing ovation became a symbol of how misunderstanding could transform into appreciation when people were given the opportunity to grow and evolve in their understanding of cultural authenticity and artistic expression. The same venue that had witnessed Jimmy's greatest humiliation had become the site of his most complete vindication. Years later, many of the people who had been present at both the 1967 disaster and the 1982 triumph would describe those events as defining moments in their own understanding of what it meant to be truly Jamaican, and to appreciate consciousness-raising music that could speak to both local and global audiences simultaneously. The contrast between those two nights at National Stadium became a powerful metaphor for the journey that both artists and audiences must sometimes take to find common ground and mutual understanding in their shared cultural heritage. Jimmy's story proved that redemption was possible even after the most devastating rejection, and that consciousness-raising music could ultimately bridge any cultural divide when given enough time and opportunity to demonstrate its authentic spiritual power. If this incredible story of how Jimmy Cliff was booed off stage by his own people, only to receive a 12-minute standing ovation from the same audience 15 years later, moved you deeply today, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more amazing tales of how consciousness-raising artists persevere through rejection and misunderstanding to ultimately find acceptance and celebration for their authentic spiritual messages.